They say a week is a long time in politics, but I hope not too long, as on this week's Perspective I've got some of the highlights from interviews I recorded at June Tynwald. First up, Chief Minister Alf Cannon. You made a statement to Tynwald, and you can tell me what the statement was about, but on the one hand you seemed to be talking of a need for government departments to look at their expenditure and reduce or become more efficient in the way they deliver services. And yet you were very careful to skirt around describing any of this as cuts.
So the announcement today was about 3 commitments that we're bringing forward for a programme of work over the summer and into the autumn that we believe the time is right now to do that. First of all was a commitment to a low tax economy, to work with the Treasury Minister to make sure he's in a good position to deliver a budget that benefits everybody and keeps us aligned as a low tax economy. Secondly, a commitment to look at people, headcount and efficiency across government, to undertake an exercise now with the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Officers within departments, so an internal exercise around headcount numbers. Part of that will also be around looking at the data that is being produced, the way that data is being reported as well, and that then we will update ourselves on the results of that over the autumn, and I'll come back to Tynwald in November with any outcome from that. And then the third commitment was to engage actively with the board of the steam packet now around steam packet pricing and to understand what further transparency can be brought to that, and as part of that whether or not we can achieve an objective of making ensure and convincing ourselves that steam packet is working as hard financially as possible for the benefit of our economy and people on the island.
One thing you alluded to in the in your winding up comments to the debate was, who'd be the Chief Minister, because on the one hand you try to do certain things, but by the time you've done them, various circumstances may have changed and this and that. There's a really good example this week of an opportunity that has presented itself for the Department of Education to save a substantial amount of money, but it would appear that has been rejected both by the department and by Council of Ministers.
Well, that's about quality as well. So one has to take the quality of education. We've absolutely dismissed closing our valuable primary schools, which are bringing a huge amount of benefit both in terms of the education that they're delivering, but also to the societies that exist around them as well. So that's been dismissed. There were other parts of that report, however, which are important that we properly respond to and do have value. So, absolutely, we must look at the costs. We must look at in terms of where we are spending our money. We must look at ensuring that items such as the headcount, for example, are kept properly under control. But we've also got to look at the quality of the service as well that is being delivered.
Every year, I would guess, since 2009, following the loss of the substantial amount of VAT money from the revenue sharing arrangement with the UK, government departments have been required to check to make sure that they are delivering services as efficiently as possible. So what has actually changed? I mean, you're suggesting now that the officers in all the departments have to go and do this exercise again, and that miraculously some new efficiencies are going to be found which don't involve cutting services?
So first of all, what I said and I pointed to was that we have a funding formula in place, particularly around health and social care, which outstrips, everything being equal, everything remaining in this current status quo in terms of our expenditure commitments and taxation commitments, outstrips effectively the ability of the economy effectively to pay for it without change. And that change either means that we seek additional revenues or, of course, we look at government spending. Now, of course, I think the first thing that everybody wants us to do, and it's clearly expressed in no uncertain terms, I think both in Tynwald and outside of Tynwald, and make sure that we're efficient as possible in terms of where we are spending our money within government. We need to undertake that exercise. And we also need to ensure that we are directing and allocating money properly. I make no bones about it, Phil. A lot of this really is because of the cost of healthcare. We've put in place a funding formula. We've just put in sorts of additional sums through additional revenue requirements that have been brought forward, i.e. department overspending or Manx Care overspending against its budget, and of course by bringing forward initiatives to tackle waiting lists. And I talked about the 3,500 operations that we already have delivered in general surgery, ophthalmology and orthopaedics. But we know there's still a huge amount to do. Nevertheless, if we're going to carry on funding at the levels that have been set out to that funding formula, we're going to have to make a proper assessment to make sure that money that's been distributed around government in other areas is being properly spent and targeted in such a way as having clear benefits for our economy. So there's a piece of work to be done. And I would also say that the last 3 years for the island, for the government, for the economy has been hugely turbulent. Coming out of COVID took us 6 months. Cost of living crisis, some people will argue, is not over, but that was almost a dominant year within government, as has been the industrial tribunal and the uncertainty and the net results that have happened in terms of our change of senior leadership, reforming, putting together operations performance boards, and keeping the public sector working together. And I pay tribute today to the workers across the public sector, because I think and believe actually, when you look back over the last 3 years, as an island, we've come through incredibly well when you look at the political turmoil that surrounds us. Nevertheless, it's right now to start putting forward the initiatives that we need to make sure that we're in a robust position when it comes to budgets next year. We want a low tax economy. We want people to have as much money back in their pockets as possible, but we've also got to find a way of keeping healthcare costs particularly under control.
Part of your role, of course, is not to scare the horses before the horses perhaps need to be scared, perhaps at some point. But at the moment, you don't know that needs to happen. We know that the public across Europe are disillusioned with politicians. They feel that politicians don't tell them, they don't give the straight answers and the straight talking that's required. In essence, if you're to save money, at some point, decisions are going to have to be taken about the number of services supplied or delivered by government.
Yeah, so look, I think last budget, the Treasury Minister set out a fiscal plan, which, all things being equal, worked, except for, I think, this perennial issue and this nervousness around healthcare funding, and partly to solve the problem at the time, to make sure we stayed on an even keel. We brought forward this increase in income tax. But that's not a position that any of us want to retain. We also want to ensure that the economy broadly is successful, and that means if the domestic economy is going to be successful, people need to have as much of their income kept as possible, and the government rightly takes what it needs to deliver the public services that keep us going as a society, and indeed that the public want. This is not a case of panic. This is a case of a natural evolution, undertaking the right exercises, bringing forward the right initiatives at the right time. And this wasn't just, of course, about efficiency. And we're doing this, by the way, internally. This isn't consultants. It's an internal exercise around the headcount numbers, efficiency of departments. But, of course, we've got these taxation commitments and also this commitment around travel costs and the steam packet. So all three will have knock-on benefits for society if we get them right. But as yet, I haven't seen the results of an efficiency review, and until we understand what those results are showing, then we're not in a position to take anything further at this point.
The Chief Minister there grappling with the thorniest of issues. Tim Glover next. You had a series of questions, but you also had some concerns about the closure of the mid-rent scheme, which was a trial scheme the DOI set up about 8 years ago.
Yeah, it was only in very late April that I started to get contact with a couple of constituents that are obviously in Colby, where the trial is at Croncullen there, and took it up on their behalf and did get confirmation from the Department of Infrastructure that they were closing the mid-rent pilot scheme, and the properties there, the 5 properties, will become part of the department's public sector housing stock once the existing tenancies come to an end. And I've been quite surprised that that's come as a surprise to the former minister. He obviously wasn't aware that this had happened, and a couple of other members who've been involved in actually formulating the document that we're talking about housing need were unaware that this had finished as well, because that document talks quite a lot about mid-rent as one of the potential solutions to our housing needs.
So as yet, have you been able to find out why the pilot was closed? I mean, the general view seems to have been that it was successful.
I haven't, and I'm puzzled as well, because I know that there's a few local authorities that were looking to develop some sort of existing scheme like this along these lines as a way forward for their provision of housing stock on the island. We don't know yet whether we're getting a housing association. Is that going to be part of that offering? As yet, we haven't had that answered.
And this is one of the worst things that a government department can do, I suspect, which is close something off without giving clarity as to what happens next.
Well, indeed, and I mean, fundamentally, I've been dealing with my constituents and trying to address their needs, because you always put them first and try and sort things out for them. One we've got somewhere, one we're still trying to work out where they're going to go. They've got till, I think, June next year is the end of their tenancy there. So they're obviously in a bit of a lumber then as to what do we do? Where do we go? How do we save for a deposit, which maybe is coming more immediately than was intended when they entered the scheme.
And indeed, finding somewhere to rent is not necessarily going to be an easy thing.
That's one of the biggest things I'm facing in dealing with constituents at the moment who have either had some sort of domestic rearrangement of affairs, and they get half the proceeds of the house, and where do they go?
I mean, this is an interesting point, because I'm told that something in the region of 600 houses have been built over the course of the last 3 years since the last election, at which a housing crisis was declared by pretty much all candidates. I think it was in the Chief Minister's speech in relation to efficiency and delivery. So if that number of houses have been built, how come we've still got a housing crisis?
Well, a very good question, one I'm putting as well out there, and we're talking at the moment, just to be clear to the listeners, before we've heard the summing up from the chair concerning this housing need report that we're discussing. And one of the questions I've asked and are waiting for the answer is, the first thing I looked at in this report was, is there a definition of affordable housing? There isn't. I may have answered my own question, because it does suggest 3 potential strands as to where we're going to go, and maybe whichever one of those is chosen will be the definition of what is affordable housing. But I would have thought, if we're looking at housing need and the definition of what is affordable housing is quite crucial to that, I would say.
One thing, though, that you did get answers to is in relation to the significant increase in relation to fallen stock that farmers are now going to face. Are you reasonably content with the answers you received?
No, it's quite simply because this was sprung out of the blue. There wasn't any consultation. There was consultation with DEFA, but there was no consultation directly with the farmers through the Manx National Farming Union, because they got an email, and that was the first they knew about it. So again, I question the way government communicates with parties all round. I think that's been a weakness for several decades probably now. And we also don't know when Phase 2 and Phase 3 of these increases are going to come in. Phase 1 is an enormous increase for farmers straight away, some of which are over 150% higher than what they're currently paying. And of course, it's a monopoly situation in effect, because they have to use the animal waste plant, because there's no provision to bury stock or burn stock on their land that is not there currently. I asked the question, were they going to ease those restrictions, and got something that they're consulting on. So no, not satisfied, because we don't know how far into this process we are, or indeed how far the process will go.
And this comes at a time when it is fair to say farmers continue to struggle. There certainly haven't been any green shoots, or at least any green shoots that have been seem to have been nibbled off by the slugs. It's not a good sort of financial environment to be introducing very significant increases.
Well, this is a gripe I've got currently at the moment. I mean, government departments are under pressure. We all know that. They're under quite severe financial pressure. We had the statement yesterday from the Chief Minister very much alluding to that. And the budget caused an outrage as well, in that 2% tax was put on people without government looking at its own affairs and where it could save money. So for government just to try and get out of the current financial constraints that it's got, for departments to try and increase their income, they have to bear in mind what the consequences of putting that rise is on the people that it's affecting. And I don't think any consideration's been made of that in this current situation. And I understand the frustrations from farmers that are in my constituency that have quite rightly come to me and said, what on earth is all this about?
Were you impressed, generally content, or dissatisfied, or any other option with what the Chief Minister had to say about the delivery and efficiencies of his government?
I was more confused, if anything. I'm glad that it's being looked at, but I think Chris Thomas hit the nail on the head, but was accused of setting the hares running. Are we talking about redundancies or not? We were told it was an exercise. Well, what's the point of an exercise if there's no outcome to it? So I'm not the wiser, to be quite honest, as to where we're going with this, and I await further details, and we'll certainly be looking to table a few questions on this.
And the Chief Minister, in his summing up, was at pains to not talk about cutting services or reducing the size of government. It was merely he used some tremendously diplomatic words, but words to the effect of departments are being asked to look to see what efficiencies they could make if perhaps at some point in the future their budgets were challenged.
I think he said 5 to 10% lower budget was the premise, wasn't he?
Over the course of the last, certainly 10, maybe even 15 years, surely to goodness, every single department of government has been looking to try and find out ways in which it can deliver services more efficiently. So you have to wonder what's left to find.
Yeah, and it is a conundrum, because if you are talking cuts, the last thing that the public want to see is that the frontline services are not as efficient and not as good as they've got now. They would argue that in some cases they would actually prefer to have a higher quality of frontline service. We know, for example, there are difficulties at Manx Care recruiting. We know that the Chief Constable has said that the blue line he has currently is very, very thin, and he is worried about being able to carry out the mandate that he's been given. So there's a very, very fine balancing act in all of this to be carried out, and I would urge just a bit of caution.
And then finally, then you had a question to the Minister for Enterprise, who, it's fair to say, struggled a little in an interview a few days ago with Manx Radio with some of the figures his department had. Do you think the Minister has had a better grip on those figures when he gave the answers in Tynwald this week?
Well, I think he was a little bit more prepared to concede that what had originally been put out wasn't quite what was intended to be interpreted in the way that it has been. And the figures were questioned initially by several backbenchers during the debate. And then, obviously, Manx Radio did the interview as well, where the Minister and the Chief Executive, or Chief Officer rather now, seemed a little bit under pressure. He says that he can show that the video for Love Bank Shop Local, which received, they say, 170,000 views, that can be verified. But obviously the public can't see that at the moment, and he's agreed to publish that verification of how they arrive at that figure. More worryingly, the other one was that Visit Isle of Man claims it received a PR reach of 5.8 billion. Well, I just did a little bit of research on that, and Forbes, which is a pretty reliable source of information, say that there are 5.35 billion internet users worldwide. So we're claiming a bigger PR reach than even that. So,
even so, we're even at the 5.35 billion, that's assuming every single one of them got to see the a media release or statement from Visit Isle of Man.
Yes, and we got the spin that there's a caveat to that, was the phrase that was used, and that this is potential PR reach. Well, that's not quite how it was put out the first time. So he's agreed to publish the marketing mechanisms that are used to arrive at a figure of 5.8 billion. But honestly, that just was mind-boggling when that came out.
And it does seem like a bit of a silly thing, and possibly even a meaningless thing. And I think this was referred to in the questions, that actually wouldn't it be more use to have figures that actually mean something in terms of how many of those people, if it was 5.8 billion, are actually interested in coming to the Isle of Man, because even if it was 1 billion, I think we might struggle to accommodate them.
Well, and I think that was shown up in the question to the Chief Minister, following up on a written question I'd put in about where all these new jobs that keep being talked about by Komen were and what sectors they were in. And straight away, it was in there, it said that there were 4,855 working in public sector education. Well, if you go back to the Island Plan that had come out for 23-24, that showed 2,379. So there's a difference there of 2,476 people. So what base set are they using? So the figures that government has to put out have to mean something to the public. You can't do a very quick search like that, which anyone can do, and come up with a baffling anomaly. Figures that government needs to put out need to be clear and present and relevant. And the Chief Minister has conceded on that and is going to see if there is a consistent source that can be used, so there is a more consistent set of figures coming out from government, because it undermines trust in government, all this. And that's a very dangerous way for government to be going.
DEFRA Minister Claire Barber steered the climate change progress report through Tynwald, but first those increased charges for fallen stock.
Yeah, and it was certainly a concern to me, and I know it's a concern to other colleagues in DEFRA, and we've worked with the union, spoken to the DOI around this, and yeah, it affects, as you say, farmers, it's affecting the meat plant, and also fish processing as well, because those are the main users of the rendering plant. And the reality is that we're mid-year, so people have already put their costings together for their year, they know what their input costs are, they know what they might expect to get back, and suddenly there's this significant extra cost, and as you say, on an industry that really they have no choice, they have to use it, that's what the law says, and we're really keen to make sure that in conversation with DOI we make that position very clear, that actually there are some things where we provide a service to the public because actually it's in the best interest of the Isle of Man, in the reasons obviously around bringing this in, around not wanting fallen stock buried on farm. We've put those things in place in times before I was here, and for good reason, and we now find ourselves in a position where actually then farmers are being penalised for that. As as you say, some of these increases are in 200% category, which is a significant cost to bear for farmers at a time when things are already really tight.
There was one suggestion during question time that, well, farmers can just get this covered through insurance. I would imagine it would be very difficult to get insurance for natural deaths of stock.
Yeah, I'm certainly not convinced that insurance is the right solution if it was even there and viable. And of course, if you start claiming on the insurance a number of times for things that from an insurance perspective are quite low, but from a business perspective are quite high, then your premium goes up. So it's a bit of a catch-22 for farmers. So I'm certainly, from my perspective, I don't think that's the solution. I absolutely think we need to continue sitting around the table with DOI, and I'm grateful that they've been willing to do that. We've spent time talking with them. The minister's definitely listening, and has been keen to go away and do some of his own research. And I think it's shown the depth of feeling actually within the agricultural community that this has come very quickly onto the floor of Tynwald. And I always think that's a very clear indicator actually of just the strength of feeling around this. And the union are rightly lobbying around this point because the cost increases are just huge.
And some of the comparative figures produced by the union demonstrate that in the surrounding countries of the Isle of Man, the costs are substantially lower now than the ones that the DOI are trying to impose.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of reasons around that. The primary one being economies of scale, and we know that's the case on the Isle of Man. So when we put a facility in place, a government facility that we then expect everyone to use, we also have to acknowledge that we need to manage that cost position. We can't just simply push all those costs onto the end consumer. And as much as in principle, I support the idea that user pays. I get that, but we also have to understand when the thing we're asking them to do is a regulatory thing that we've put in place, and actually they had what was a viable alternative before that existed.
The other item that you've steered through is the climate change report. You, together with many who are pressing on with the various government policies relating to climate change, must be aware that there's quite a significant swing in mood, particularly in Europe in the recent European elections, which does seem to demonstrate that the public aren't getting this. There were quite a few calls in the debate that perhaps the report needs to be much more focused on showing what the actual harm to the people of the Isle of Man is from climate change.
Yeah, and I tried to touch on some of that actually in the debate. And one of the key figures actually is that the biggest spend that we've had from the Climate Change Fund has been on people's homes. And actually that's a win-win for everyone from what I can see, and certainly from feedback we've had. So the Energy Efficiency Scheme, Green Living Grant Scheme are the two current schemes. I think it's fair to say the Green Living Grant Scheme had a rocky start and it hasn't probably had quite the uptake that we might have hoped. And we're learning from that because we're obviously building a new scheme now. And the Energy Efficiency Scheme, though, I think actually has been really, really well taken up, and that's been far less process driven. It's been far more about people coming forward. We've done spot checks. We've just to make sure we're providing our own governance process, but providing people with the things they need to insulate their homes. And obviously that's an absolute win in terms of emissions because we're reducing the amount of electricity or gas you might need to heat the home. But it's also a win for the consumer, the person who's taking the loft insulation or radiator control valves or Nest system, whatever it might be, because ultimately they're finding themselves in a position with lower bills. And so I think for me, that's where there are some significant opportunities within the climate change agenda to probably tell that story a little bit more, is around those things where actually climate change action doesn't just solve global issues, it actually solves consumer cost issues, which are a really important thing at this time.
And of course, across the Isle of Man, I think it's deemed that we spend something like a third of the total spend on energy on heating buildings. Last time I did the calculation, it was something in the region of £50 million a year that's spent across the island heating our homes and buildings. That's a big amount of money, even forgetting the potential saving for individuals. That would be a huge amount of money that would stay on the island and do all the things that the Treasury Minister is desperate to see in terms of growing the economy.
Absolutely, and through the schemes we're buying stuff from local suppliers, we're using local people to fit for those people who need that additional support, we're using local companies to do the initial surveys, so we really are also making sure that money's spent locally, providing local benefit in terms of emissions and providing the benefit to those people who are putting that insulation in or installing those different initiatives that we are able to provide. And I really would encourage anyone who thinks that they might need energy efficiency support to come and talk to the team in DEFRA. There's loads of information online about the energy efficiency scheme. We're still going to be continuing to run that scheme until the new scheme takes over, although the Green Living Grant Scheme we know is coming to the end of new applications, and that's to allow a phased time for people to go through the processes then of having the audits done and then having any work that might need to be done in time for the new scheme to take place. And as I say, the new scheme wants to draw on the information we have, that information around the cost, those quick wins, which sorts of houses do we want to try and tackle first, and looking at different mechanisms. There'll probably be a bit of a blend between grants, perhaps loans as well, acknowledging that sometimes we know, and this was again in the debate, that it's actually in everyone's interest to put things in place, but the cost is so prohibitive for the capital installation cost. So once you've got it in, you'll save the money over the lifetime by changing to an air source heat pump, for example. And at the minute, we've got the data from the MU who've been doing a trial in terms of air source heat pump installations as well. So that's been really beneficial.
Do you think we're doing enough, or you're doing enough as government, to explain to people what the real saving could be? I mean, I know we talk about annual savings, but perhaps if people saw this, because effectively a lot of the stuff that you're encouraging people to do, insulating homes in particular, over the lifetime of a home, or certainly the lifetime of the people making that investment, if you're looking over 20 years, some of these savings are going to be very, very substantial indeed. Certainly enough to allow people to have several wonderful family holidays.
Yeah, and we should have the heat decarbonisation report will come out, and that will tell a lot of that sort of narrative in that detail that I think you're seeking, and certainly I think that is beneficial. And I think we can always tell people more. I think one of the big benefits of the energy efficiency scheme actually is that the team have been going out to different events, two different groups, talking to them, explaining. They've got a lot of visual information. The energy doctors have been going out to people's houses, and I say the feedback from that has been brilliant. I think it then brings it down to that, how does this affect me? And I think that's really a key, because people in Laxey are really engaged on the flooding issue, for example, but we need to make sure everyone understands that the flooding issue is a cost that is going to be borne by the whole island, in terms of us putting prevention in, whether that be coastal sea defences, whether that be from rivers, banks flooding. There's definitely an inherent cost across our agriculture sector, whether that be because crops can't be effectively planted, or whether that be because lambing's significantly affected by rainfall. All of these things are things that will cost us. We talked yesterday about the possibility we may need to bring a reservoir back into use because we'll need additional water. That's just for the current population, but obviously we also, to manage our demographic challenges, we want to increase the population, the working population. So actually there's also consideration from that. And I think we're in a position really where all of those things need to be considered in the round, to ensure that we understand what the possible total cost could be.
DOI Minister Tim Crookall next. Talking to Minister for the DOI, Tim Crookall. And maybe if we start with a positive, Mr. Ashford had a question down about repairs to and maintenance of various parts of the Marine Drive. And you had some good news to report on that.
Yeah, Pigeon Stream car park. It's been a long time since they actually started looking at it and getting down to it. But that work he was asking about when it's going to be completed and tidied up. And I had actually gone up the night before, and the guys have done a good job up there. So it has done. They've got Armco right way around the car park now, and it's all been tidied up. So that job is complete, which I'm delighted to say because it has gone on for a while.
And I suppose as a result of the Child Guard videos, which are probably the famous prompt for some of this work, what I think many people might find difficult to understand is how we end up in these sorts of situations. Some of that is bureaucracy, some of that is shared responsibility. Do you think it's going to be something that we will be able to crack?
It's got to be easier than what we make it at the moment, Phil. It's you're right. You know, there's us involved, there's Braddon commissioners, there's Douglas Corpy involved up there, and over the last year or so, you know, there was all sorts of rusty yellow railings, and the railings on top of the wall were rusty and needed replacing and painting and stuff. And most of that seems to have been done. When I had a look the other day, most of that seems to be done. Yes, I think there's still a few potholes in the road further down, but it's actually far, far better than it was before Charles did his video. And I had a meeting with Charles. I was the one that he said he'd met with one person. I was the one that met with him after he'd done his video, and I actually sort of applaud him for doing it, for making us do this, because we walk past these things, we drive past them, and we get used to them, and we just ignore them in the end. And that's all of us, yeah, right the way across, not only in government, but just everybody. And we all just think, well, somebody else will report it, and we ignore it. And we absolutely need to report these things and get them done. Yes, it'll take time to get it done, and yes, it takes money. But do you know what? It's worth it, because Marine Drive is a beautiful place to go for a walk. And I'd walked it a couple of times last year with, you know, the dogs and things. And when I was up there the other night, there's loads of people up there and stuff. They're great areas, and we need just to do it. If we can't do it, you know, don't take offence without being told. Don't take too much offence when people tell us that there's an issue there. Let's go out and do it and sort it. Get it on a list to get done.
One of the areas that you also have got done, but there does seem to be some delay in getting the operator to actually use it, is the Isle of Man ferry terminal in Liverpool. What is actually happening there?
Yeah, as you're right, the building is done. We're ready to go. We're literally, it's an operational issue now, waiting for Steam Packet, the guys, just to say they're ready to go. And as I said yesterday, June Tynwald, you know, they've got a lease on the old Linkspan, if you like, till the end of this month. As far as we know, that's the end of it. So we're hoping in the next couple of weeks they will be on the new one, and we look forward to that day very soon, hopefully.
And are we likely to find out how much ultimately the whole thing cost in the not too distant future?
We'll get a rough figure, I would think, in the not too distant future, but obviously you have a period after that of snagging and all sorts, and the final bill, I'm led to believe, will come in sort of a year afterwards. And it was like the Douglas Promenade here. You know, you have discussions with the contractors and things. There's always, as I say, snagging and other bits and pieces. So I'm sure it'll be about a year afterwards that we'll get the final figure on that.
And inevitably, that's going to create a headline or two, because the initial costs really did rocket, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. I mean, you know, they started off with $3.5 million to actually lease the land, because don't forget, it is leased. We don't actually own it. It is leased for 234 years, I think it was at the time, so we're nearly 230 years. But yeah, and then it went to sort of 12.5 to 25, and then before you know it, it went up. It was 40, and then we had that break over the summer period last year, or the year before last, and it went up to over 50, and now we're regularly talking about 70. It's absolutely a tremendously big number, but we need to make sure that we only pay for what we need to pay, and that'll take a while to sort out, I think.
And part of the business case for this is, well, first of all, it's a showcase to the Isle of Man, welcoming people to the ferry service, but also there is some return to the government on this, isn't there? There is a fee that the Steam Packet will have to pay for utilising the facility.
Yeah, absolutely. So, over the years, that money will come back in very slowly. I'm not sure that we haven't decided on that figure yet, and I'm certainly not going to put it out there until it is signed and agreed on. But yeah, there is an income back to government on that, so that's a plus point if you like.
We'll scoot along then. E-scooters. Sorry, did you see what I did there? E-scooters. You've decided that despite them being quite a fun and interesting mode of transport, they're not a high enough priority for the department to introduce regulation to make them legal on the Isle of Man.
No, there's all sorts of issues with them, but you know what? There isn't that many of them, and at the moment, as I said yesterday, they are illegal to be on a public highway, so please don't do it. But there's not that many of them, and I think we just haven't got the time at the moment to do the legislation for what is probably maybe a dozen of them. There's more around during TT. You do see quite a few people bring them over, and especially up around the paddocks and stuff like that. But I think we're also looking to kill off people's fun a bit too here as well, if we're not careful and stuff. If there's issues with them as we go on, then we'll have a look at it again, or somebody will have a look at it again in the future. But I don't see as we have to be looking at it too closely at the moment. And if we make them legal to on the road, people will talk about, do we have to have insurance with them and all sorts. And I've had conversations with the insurance company, and they're frightened to death of it, having seen what's happened across in the UK and that. And the way around this, we've had a conversation, may well be that at the end of the day, the way will be that when you go to Liverpool and places like that, they have these electric scooters that are all rented by people from one company. That might be the way to do it, but people want their own. You can have your own on private land, but at the moment they're illegal on the highways.
And finally then, the issue surrounding fallen stock. Is it perhaps there's been some miscommunication or maybe misunderstandings, because certainly as far as the agricultural industry is concerned, the increase being proposed by the department is massive, and it will mean that our farmers will be paying substantially more than their competitors in surrounding countries.
Yeah, I understand that, and as we said yesterday, we're talking in some respects, it might be a 100% increase, and that's on £3 or £4. So we're talking about another £4 or something like that. But at the top end, I think we were talking about a bull at the moment, which was £53, which will go up to something like 100. I can't remember exactly. I haven't got the figures with me at the moment now. But it was going up it was equated to £185, and somewhere in there you had horses, which are about £100 and things like that, which sounds like a lot of money. But, it's costing the department, nearly £650,000 a year, and we're only getting £120,000 roughly back. And so we've got a lot of money we need to sort of get back, if you like, or cover those costs. And that's coming out of taxpayers' money at the moment. So we need to, we've been working with DEFRA, and we're going to get an answer to this, and we'll be able to work it up. And we've had meetings, or there has been meetings with the MNFU, and there'll be another couple of meetings coming up in the next month. It wasn't handled very well. I'm happy to admit. I'm not happy to admit that. I'll admit that. There should have been a bit more notice and maybe a bit more conversations had. But it's something we've got to deal with, and we'll try and do better in the future.
Finally, former Education Minister Julie Edge gives her take on the schools funding review, which Daphne Kane told us about on last week's programme.
So obviously it was an independent report, so I've always been very vocal about this, about full transparency. We're in a government that wants transparency, so I did feel it should be published, because the response and the policy direction beyond the publication of an independent report can still happen. It doesn't mean to say you accept all of the recommendations or conclusions in an independent report.
We've been told, though, that a lack of response from the department is the reason for the significant delay in the publication of this report. As you were minister for much of the time, from when the report was available, presumably the finger of accusation is pointed to the time when you were in charge.
Completely dispute that, Phil. I think that's totally disingenuous if that has been said, and I would dispute that strongly.
So you did respond to the report?
Certainly not publicly. Clearly, you are in a process, but I didn't respond publicly, no. However, I completely dispute those facts.
Okay, so in that case, presumably you did, as a department, issue some responses to the recommendations. Clearly, the headline-grabbing recommendation is closing 8 inefficient schools. Now, it's more about the system, I think, that's described as inefficient than necessarily each of the schools being inefficient. But were you willing to consider that recommendation?
Certainly from a school's point of view, I think we need to be looking at the whole school's infrastructure across the island, making sure that every student has got equal opportunity across the island and the best opportunities to progress in life. And certainly, some of the areas picked up in the report, and it is an independent report, do make you sit back and think, actually, there is some really good, valid information here. What's the best way to deliver education in rural areas, for instance, up in the north of the island? Is it 3 or 4 smaller schools, or is it better to ensure every student has access to the best facilities, best educators, and opportunity to develop in a bigger social setting? These were all things that needed to be considered, but there's no action, and quite concerned that, again, we need more support, more help to actually come up with another. They're going to review what's in the report again. So actually, what's actually come out from the department now is really not not worthy of anything, but let's look forward to July and let's debate it. It needs to be Tynwald decisions, not just departmental, and that's the challenge when you're in a department. But these are island decisions. This is island infrastructure, the education of our young people, the future, and particularly all of those that are requiring additional educational needs in some form or other. There's been no funding, very, very little. I think Treasury have sort of tried to indicate, there's an extra £3 million gone in. That, it needs to be forthcoming. It's clear there's a funding deficit in education. I've always said it. I will always fight for it. The new minister thinks she's got an £18 million windfall. She hasn't. And I think this is going to be the interesting part now. Where's the money coming from? If we're going to fund it and not make the changes recommended in the report?
Because there's something in the region of £12 million identified for additional educational needs and children with complex needs. This is extra money that's required. Now, the savings that were identified in the report were something in the region of 7 million, around 3.5 million of which would have been through the closure of 8 schools. I mean, you're not a minister now, so you don't have to sort of answer in vague terms. Were you prepared to consider those closures? Would you have agreed indeed to some of those recommendations for closure?
I think any national politician should consider what's best for the island overall. It shouldn't be about your constituency area or anything like that. We should be considering the best opportunity for education, its facilities and funding for the island. And certainly that's tough decisions that need to be made, and some of those tough decisions could have been made. I would have made them if they were the right decisions, but there was much more discussion needed to take place with our schools, with our teachers. They're the professionals. They know what's required.
And indeed, one of the quite stark findings of the report was in relation to additional educational needs and children with complex needs. There seems to be an explosion in numbers of children in these categories. During your time, did the department have any understanding as to what was causing this?
Certainly, obviously. It's always been quite a large budget. Additional educational needs has always been a large budget. It's dispersed across the island in different centres at different schools. But the complex needs and the units that look after complex needs, people do get mixed up. Complex needs can be health issues as well as learning difficulties. And then we also have children with additional educational needs, which just might be the learning complexities. And currently we have these all mixed into single units. The report says that it might be more cost effective to build specialist units. Do we need an autism? We've got an autism strategy now that's come out from the Department of Health and Social Care. We're still working a little bit disjointed and a little bit in silos, would be my view around that. What we need to look is for additional educational needs and additional support for anybody with an additional learning need, and the best way to deliver that, most cost-effective, best way to deliver it, and to give those individuals, it should all be about the students, the best chance in life and the best opportunities to go on to whatever's their choice.
I will ask a final time, would you have cut or effectively closed one or two, maybe all of the schools that were identified, had you still been minister and been given a free hand?
I would, and I think they're the right decisions as a national politician, that you need to be making the tough. The Chief Minister keeps saying, I'm going to be fiscally responsible, I'm going to make tough decisions. Well, let's see where we get with this now on many areas. Where are these tough decisions going to be? Would I be recommending that possibility for efficiencies is losing teachers? No, I would not. That would be, totally wrong. What we should be looking at is across government where these skills and people's skill set can be best met, and don't lose any of our professionals in haste when there's lots of areas that there could be massive savings across government. Education doesn't feature in the Council of Ministers' updated island plan. Only in March this year, education didn't feature as the top 6 priority. Where does that? And that is one of the big challenges I was not impressed with that at all, that did not come out of this Council of Ministers, that education was not one of the top 6. We're going to attract people to the island if we've got an excellent education system and facilities.
So that was some of the skeet from June Tynwald. What do you reckon? Will the Chief Minister get the efficiencies he's looking for? Will the farmers face further huge increases for using a facility they have no option but to use? Would you be willing to see services being cut if departments can't deliver the savings needed to pay for the increases needed to maintain a good healthcare service? What about that chat the Chief Minister plans to have with the arm's length Isle of Man steam packet company? Presumably the company is within shouting distance of government, but will they be willing to respond positively to government's arm's length requests? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Myos and Geisha Crum. Thanks for listening.